Thank you, Sandra, and a very good morning to you all, and a special welcome to our guest speakers of this morning. We have Andrew Coutts, CEO of Hollard Insure. I think Andrew needs no introduction, but Andrew, I think on behalf of the team and all those present, we wish you well in your new role. Then we have Johan van den Heever, who's the head of EFI Global Africa, and Werner Siebert, who's the lead forensic engineer of EFI Global. And just doing a bit of a check on EFI, and I'll quote from Google, it's a well-respected expert in fire investigations, forensic engineering, and environmental consultants. So I'm sure we're in for a very interesting discussion this morning. So the ever-changing insurance and reinsurance markets are forcing change into the way clients, brokers, and insurers view risks, with the emphasis on improved risk management and risk mitigation, without which, and I'm sure you all have become aware of this, insurance protection becomes unaffordable if available. As we look to find solutions for our clients and impact on our industry, I give you feedback from the World Federation of Insurance Intermediaries World Council meeting, which was held 2 weeks ago in Washington, and attended by over 100 national associations from 80 different countries. And from the following points, you'll hear and see that we're not alone in the issues that we are facing with. So all markets are grappling with issues relating to the protection gaps, the regulatory burden, consumer literacy and education, and I would suggest that this extends into our own industry, cybersecurity, the use of artificial intelligence, and a new and emerging theme is that of disinformation and its impact on our industry. So we're not alone, and I'm sure we will hear more of this in the coming months from Lizelle, Sam, and Butsi. So grateful thanks to Henriette for putting this session together, and to Andrew, Johan, and Werner for what we're about to hear and about to learn. And then, Sandra, if I may, a commercial. This webinar will be followed up in the coming months by a further webinar carrying on from the theme we're going to talk about today, or some of the themes being put together by the Swiss Reinsurance Company. And then we also have the PI webinar, which is going to be hosted by our broker and our PI underwriter. And I'm sure we will hear more about those from Sandra in the coming months. So I leave it to you. Just let's sit back and enjoy, and let's learn from Andrew, Johan, and Werner. And we really look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Morning, Barry. Thank you very much indeed. It's really a pleasure to be able to spend some time back in the industry again. I had a year off. I'm still getting all my purple wardrobe going. I'm much more comfortable in the purple jersey at the moment than I am in the purple Speedo. But hopefully that too is something to look forward to come October time. I do have a presentation which I'm going to share now, and it will then come through, and then we'll take it from there. It should launch in a second. You should have it up. So the topic I'm going to talk to and spend a little bit of time today talking about is just our market, touch a little bit on our reinsurance conditions, and then a bit about risk management, and then some of the specific challenges that our market is currently faced with. Johan and Werner will go into it in more detail. So kicking off just with an overview of the current market conditions. These were pre the events of the last 3 days, and those have unfortunately shifted our market significantly. But it does give you a view of muted economic growth and really a net negative picture for South Africa. We had a tough challenge in the Q3 of 2024 on agri, and that continues to be very weather dependent. So we see that the instability of the GNU really came to a head with the budget speech. So we've seen that, and of course the global market sell-off that we've seen in the last 2 days following the standardized tariffs that President Trump has put through, really creating market instability. And of course, just the policy shifts and the inability for us to really drive service delivery in a GNU that's not effectively functioning. Those are clearly the net negatives that we're seeing at the moment. Some of the positives, we are seeing some better public-private partnerships happening in the transport and the power sectors. So that's good for Eskom and Transnet. We're seeing some significant improvements there. I think we're very positive still that we'll be able to get off the grey list. And then, there was an outlook for easing inflation, but all of you would have seen what happened to the rand in the last couple of days, and that will be net negative for inflation. So we can probably see that trend also turning net negative. So the macroeconomic landscape remains particularly challenging. I thought I wanted to introduce also a sector view of our commercial and corporate market. I really think that as an industry, we need to start focusing a lot more on the sectors within our economy. The days where we can just be generalists are becoming more and more difficult. So we really need to know what markets we want to grow and how we want to grow and what is the customer requiring in those segments. So it's useful just to see how our market does break up. Our finance and real estate market and business services is still the biggest sector of our economy at 27%. Then we have personal services, which is then private health and wellness, education, recreational activities coming second. Then you've got trade, catering, accommodation, manufacturing, transport. You can see the pie graph over there. I think what's really important to think about when you see this, where are the opportunities in our market? What is our market share relative to those sectors? Something for a broker as well as an insurer to think about. And then the insights on what the opportunities emerge within those sectors become critical. If you look mining and natural resources, we do see the injection with commodity pricing strengthening. There's been a reinvestment happening in many of those spaces that creates opportunities. Similarly, on the manufacturing side, the more stable environment post the initial announcement of the GNU resulted in some balance sheets being made available. And we see some investments in power logistics and infrastructure, particularly in the solar space. That's driving spend, which means that we have an opportunity. Public-private partnerships and infrastructure, really an opportunity for us, initially in the guarantee phase, but also as we work into contract works, and so we go. So lots of opportunity. I still am very positive about agriculture. I think it's one of those sectors that's really accessible for almost all of us, and it's such a key part of our economy. It's a big sector, a big employment driver as well. So really opportunity in that space. And then, of course, tourism and hospitality continues to be something that really is a windfall for us, particularly in the Western Cape with the lower rand. So some nice things coming through there. And health is also an interesting sector, despite talk about potentially, a whole new approach with NHI. It continues to be an investment, an area that's adopting some or injecting some investment. So something to think about. The personalized market, similar to commercial, it's quite an interesting thing to look at. 36 million people sit in the vulnerable sector. That's 59% of our population. Really tough for us to find insurance solutions for that market in the traditional context. Then you got the mass, which is 14.8 million, 24% of the market. Again, tough. I think the key thing about the slide to highlight is we are fighting for 10.4% of the market. We are really all about fighting for that middle class and that affluent sector. In the intermediate space, we really are seeing growth in affluent, but that middle class is where we're seeing the purchase of for the first time of vehicles, and we are seeing some significant growth happening in that space. So something to think about. But this is perhaps where we see declining market share, particularly for ourselves as intermediaries and insurers. Thought just to give you a sense of the overall growth of the non-life market. So this will just give you a sense of where the industry is growing. If we look at the bar on the left-hand side first, up until 2023, we can see that the primary insurer market ended at 168 billion. That's where we sit at the end of 2023. If you add the cell captive market into that, we then hit 200 billion as an industry size in short-term or non-life gross written premium. So material, huge growth happened in 2023, 13.6% in a consolidated basis. And if you look at the primary insurer layer, businesses like Hollard and Santam and OMI, 14.7% growth happened. Now, I think that's really indicative or shows just the drive that happened around rebaselining rates. So we don't see that as necessarily new customers coming into the space, not the experience, but it was really the rebaselining of underlying rates that really drove up that increase. Moving forward, 24% was forecast at 7.7% growth. If you see the recently published results, again, of Santam and OMI, you can see that trend line pretty much tracking to that 7% number. easing a little bit, but we still do forecast in our sector above inflation growth at 6.4%. So it's positive. Longer term, we should be able to outperform inflation and therefore hopefully be able to sustain and grow our businesses into the future. If I then flip, I do see the odd hand coming up. If I can just state, we'll leave questions, 5 minutes for questions at the end. It might be easiest to answer them then. So please do keep them and note them. We will then answer them at the end. So look quickly at classes of business. Also just the bar graphs on the list. I think this is also an important thing to understand. Where are the premiums in our market? So motor continues to dominate, and then we have property and liability as the next biggest classes. And then if you move across from bar graphs to the left, you start getting a sense as to where we forecast the increase going forward. So property and motor dominating. The growth that came through was really driven by property, and I think we really saw that again through the increase cycles. And they continue to be the 2 classes that we do expect most growth going forward. So just a nice view of where the market is at, what it consists of, and where we can expect some growth. What are the trends that impact the market? So these things are also well known to you, but sometimes it's useful just to put them out there. Weather events, we're not seeing an abatement in the weather cycles. We see them continue to worsen. So we are and must model far more volatility into the weather cycles, both in flood and drought. And that's really driving an accumulation risk concern for insurers and reinsurers. It's really particularly tough in a South African context because it's impacted further by infrastructure degradation, which we're seeing happening, load shedding and water management being the 2 key drivers that most impact in that space. We do still have high crime. All of us through our businesses have been impacted by the theft of high-value vehicles and the whole telematics drive that came out to try and manage the theft of vehicles. Then the technology revolution is not going to stop. In fact, if we look at AI and agentic AI, it's really going to just go forward really fast. We actually think as a business, this AI revolution is probably going to be bigger than anything we've seen before, and really something we need to get our heads around. Obviously driving a big mobile first capability set, and we are seeing disintermediation, particularly in commodity lines, and that talks to personal lines and then the SME sector of our commercial space. So it's something that we need to be very clear about. We need to have a clear strategy to manage, and should be something that every one of us, including brokerages and insurers, must be very clear about from a strategy perspective. Products are evolving. We're seeing a lot of integration of offerings as you try to seek to maximize the time that you have with your customer to sell multiple products in one sitting. It increases margin for the product house. And then there's more usage-based or structured insurance policies really being tailored from our need, both in the personal line space and then moving into the SME space as well. And the real growth in risk management. And I think that's the real value of today's session. Really looking forward to what Johan and Werner have to say, because we have to find a way to manage this varied exposure a little bit differently. I thought to share a little bit about reinsurance. We as Hollard are currently in the market at the moment for reinsurance. So we're busy. We've had a team up in London and in Switzerland just recently. So just to give you a sense of what's happening in that market, just to share some thoughts. I thought that just to go back, reinsurance often is blamed for a lot of our challenges. So I was a broker too, so you need to sometimes share the pain. But it's been a tough environment for reinsurers and insurers and brokers and clients as we look through the last 4 or 5 years. Reinsurance has been a critical part in managing volatility. That's what it's there for. It helps us manage our income statement and reduces capital requirements. It's a huge capital buffer. Just again, many of you will know this. We typically use 5 types of reinsurance in an insurer capacity. We will use the risk excess of loss. We drive cat reinsurance. We use stop loss just to protect against accumulation of losses. It's a real capital management and efficiency tool. Then we buy FAC for individual large losses where we need specific capacity for the larger risks. And then we might also use proportional reinsurance where the reinsurer will actually share in a proportional share of the risk. Just to touch base a little bit then on the market conditions. So 21, 22, 23 is when we really saw this aggressive hardening of the reinsurance market, greater than 50% rate increases. But the fundamental shift that happened over that period was the net retention that was forced to be taken on cat programs in particular for the insurer layer. These doubled over 100%, many over 200%, some up to 300 or 400%. So this typically in the past, you might have had to take the first 50 million on a cat event. Mostly those are 200 million layers up now, where you have to take the first volatility on the insurer's balance sheet. And that was a really, really painful thing for insurers to have to take, and really in fact impacted your approach to cat modeling in particular. Move forward to 2025, and the market is definitely softer. It's significantly different to previous years. What we're seeing though is that the net retention is not coming down. They're not prepared to negotiate at all on your first retention layers. They are there. That was a structural shift that they've managed to get in through a very hard market, and they're not backing down on that. But what we are seeing is in our core programs where a reinsurer might have had 5%, they're saying I want 10%, and so it goes. So we've got this sudden capacity that's coming into our programs, and that will drive pricing down. So we do expect pricing to ease. We always have to manage in a market like this, just like you also manage with your insurers. You have to manage the balance of relationships as well as tracking the market down. So we do that, consciously, carefully with the clients in mind, but also with the ability to make sure you can go back and build long-term relationships, because there will be time when you need your reinsurers as well. What we also, though, do see is that it drives a particular opportunity for increased capacity. So that will be a good thing. We should get more capacity to our market. And also we might be able to become a little bit more structured around our reinstatement premium protections as well, which I think will be useful, in terms of how you go to market in that space. The big disruption is most likely to happen in the FAC market. Whenever you have capacity coming in, our large corporate risks really come under attack with new players coming in with new capital, who really then try to disrupt the traditional market. They come in typically with 40 or 50% lower terms, and you've got to decide if you want to follow that, or if you want to see that cycle play out. So always a bit of a strategy that happens in that space. Talking about risk management then, more specifically, I think that's important. Is it moving on my side, please, Barry?
Yes, it's moving. Yes. And you're on the risk management slide now.
Risk management service. Thank you. So just on the risk management, I think what we are absolutely seeing now in the market is a real focus on risk management as a key tool, together with things like reinsurance, to try and manage severity exposure. What is risk management as a service? I thought just to share just some thoughts to help contextualize what that looks like. And really it is about being proactive in trying to assess risk. So it's all about climate risk assessments, your resilience planning around infrastructure improvements and drainage audits, and how that can impact things like floods in particular. Then your early warning systems, we've seen that quite a lot in the telematics space and the weather space, and then predictive maintenance and monitoring solutions. These are things that you put into fire optics, fire detection, DV boards, etc. And then a real focus not only in the preventative side, but in post-loss. How do you get your client back up to speed quicker, and then build into that process the resilience ability for future losses? It's becoming a real competitive advantage space. We think that we can really make a difference here as insurers for our brokers and our clients. So we're spending lots of time on this to try and understand, how we can leverage this to be value to a client, not just at the claim stage, how we can work with our brokers to make ourselves as a joint value proposition, you as the broker, really look good in front of the clients wherever we can, by investing in deeper relationships, mitigations at source. What do those IoT, Internet of Things tools look like? How do we source them? How do we make them part of our product offerings going forward? And how can they refine our underwriting models? It really does, from a long-term profitability perspective, help clients reduce their exposure, hopefully lower the volatility, reduce the cost of insurance, and make clients more sustainable over time. It does have quite a lot of regulatory impacts. That hasn't all been plain sailing. We're doing quite a lot of work with the FSCA and the Prudential Authority around how to adopt climate stress testing models, and just bringing in those capital models that allow us to move into this space. So a lot of work being done in that space. There's also a lot of work happening globally around the reporting structures that happen with the TCFD, and then just in joint investments in disaster resilience and early warning structures. So ongoing work, lots of ongoing work in that space. Perhaps getting more specific, though, into an insurer view. So these things I'll run through quite quickly. You'll know them, but sometimes it's also nice to see, how does an insurer look at risk and underwriting? What do we focus on? What's our wagon wheel? And just to re-emphasize, it starts with a risk appetite view. We obviously have capital deployed by shareholders, and they give us an appetite to utilize that with. That will determine the type of risks, the industries, the sectors, and also the tolerance of potential losses that you have, and that you use your capital for. You would augment that and protect that with your treaties, and through that you end up presenting a value proposition to market. You then have to value, or monitor how you deploy that capital, and that we do through express portfolio and exposure monitoring tools. You track claims, you look at your product section, it's by sector, by loss, by geography. You look at the sufficiency of your pricing, the ability for your treaty to cover and manage your exposures, and then also a huge part, as I mentioned earlier, around accumulation. You then wrap that through into a set of rules. Often underwriting rules and risk requirements are determined directly by your risk appetite and how your current book is performing against that. So you continuously have to tweak those risks all the time. You might also then go to the market, as mentioned, and buy factory insurance. So your key appetite doesn't exist, your capital doesn't allow, but you can leverage reinsurer capital to find a solution for a client, and you often do that through the fac market. All this is held together by modern pricing tools, our rating engines. They've become very sophisticated. It allows you to respond quickly to market trends. And typically, most rating tools talk about PSR, price strength ratio. It's a way for us to manage your actual experience against an expected experience. And your rating over time is always by using machine learning tools to continuously update. What was your expectation? What was reality? What was your expectation? What was reality? And this is all about data. So the more data you have, the more iterative you can be about comparing actual loss to expected loss, and then iterating with new actual loss, new expected loss. And so you build up your rating tables over time to help you predict more appropriately risk going forward. On the climate side, this is the not good news part. Climate is not going away. The graph at the top shows the impact on average temperature over the last 140 years, and it's a stark graph. The blue on the right-hand side speaks all for itself. We're expecting a 1.5 degree increase between 2023 and 2027. That's just a 4-year period that we are currently in. It's not going to go away. That does mean that we can expect or continue to expect increased flash flooding. We will have, through El Nino, incidents of drought continuing across our country. We've got population growth that comes in, and then the population migration continuously also creating a concentration of exposure levels. And all this means that it's a tough environment. What does it mean for us from an insurer perspective and in a risk market? It's the variability of flood and drought impacting physical risks that we've got to manage. So that impacts pricing, your accumulation management, your capital allocation decisions critically. How are insurers responding? It's all about geolocation. You would have had this passed down to you from every insurer. We need to understand exactly where the risks are so we can map and manage that accumulation exposure. You can understand your floodplains, both pluvial and fluvial, and you can try and manage also spread of fire risks, etc. So you really need to get much better at geolocation. We're also doing a lot on probabilistic CAT models. So you try and forecast what happens if it's high tide and it's a rainfall and it's a wind and it's in this area with this is happening. So you're becoming a lot more predictive in your CAT modeling. And that's both at a flood and a hail level and a wildfire risk level. So really how you try to model and manage all these things with new data is becoming critical. And of course, there are lots of new tools in the machine learning space that helps to get a lot more effective at doing this, which is positive. I thought, although you're going to be spending quite a lot of time with Johan and Werner later around some of the key things, I thought just to share again from an insurer perspective some of the things that have driven losses over the last couple of years, and just give a sense. The fire losses have all been about aging infrastructure and poor electrical maintenance. I think you'll all be aware of that. The load shedding really didn't help. Lack of fire suppression systems, not something that typically we have done a lot of, but because of the extent and frequency of fires becoming increasingly problematic. I know sprinklers is the swear word in our industry, but it is really something we need to get our heads around to effectively manage fire. Load shedding was a key driver around power surge, but we've also had a huge number of incidences of arson, not only in the social unrest, but also as a way of a disgruntled staff member to showcase their unhappiness. In the flood side of things, climate change and extreme weather events, we've covered that. Urban sprawl and inadequate drainage systems, that's the systemic risk component that really adds to the dynamic around climate change, unique to South Africa, but actually also common in many third world countries. Our municipal planning and infrastructure maintenance adds to that. So not only do we have urban sprawl, but we have a poor history or track record in the last 10 years of managing that. So the risk on the ground is fundamentally increasing. And it's a message that it is unfortunately true for our clients, but we do need to drive it home that the risks are just not the same as they were 10 years ago. So it does flow through then into some specific risks. Thatch and cold storage also asked us to cover this a little bit. Why is thatch such a problem? Intuitively, it's a high fire hazard. But often the challenge is more is that there's a concentration risk, right? You typically have resorts that all thatch. If one goes, many go. And 2017 was a great example of that in St. Francis Bay. Fire protection is not particularly effective with thatch. So it's a real challenge. Fire breaks and that sort of thing obviously out there. But also complicated by many of your thatch lodges, etc., being in remote areas. So by the time the fire truck gets there, it's just simply way too late. Then there's the higher rebuilding cost that comes with the specialist natures of these lodges, etc. And really it just meant that there's been a very extreme lost experience on this. It drives very tight underwriting criteria, and there's very limited appetite. You might get thatch cover for a standalone house in the suburb, but more and more difficult to get them as part of estates, etc. So it's just tough. The cold storage news, again, will be covered later, and you're going to go into lots of details. But the issue for us is again, just the value of stock that sits in a cold store. Sometimes we forget about just what that means. And although it's a cold store and you think therefore not good from a fire perspective, there are lots of combustible materials that are used in those insulation panels. The polystyrene and the polyurethane are key examples. And then you've got complex ignition and electrical processes within these cold stores. The refrigeration units, the ammonia leaks that can happen, all trigger fire losses. Within the South African context, we also then have that unique thing of load shedding. So not only do you have this high fire exposure and this high load within the risk, you've also got unique things impacting through things like load shedding, unique reinsurance capacity, and then the requirements for sprinkler systems not traditionally having always been done when the original facilities were built. The claims experience I've referred to, and then I think just the stricter protection also coming through from the reinsurers as they try to comply with some global guidelines, and the updating of our own building regulation requirements in the South African context, all having impact on cold stores. The net effect for property is that rates are still under pressure. They're going to continue to be on a hardening trend. Despite relaxation of reinsurance, underlying criteria within a South African context, we'll be able to protect more from a capacity perspective. We'll get more cover, but the climate change story is not going away. The urban development issue is not going away, and the declining infrastructure is fundamentally not going away. The rates over the last 4 years are now built in. We haven't caught up to all those as the insurance market, so you are rebaselining still to catch up to increased reinsurance rates, easing now. But that retention layer remains high. So we are fundamentally having to absorb as insurers a significantly increased volatility level on that inner layer. So that remains, and we can't buy that down. So that's still problematic, although we will be looking. But you will have more capacity at the high end. So that is potential for individual, particularly your corporate clients, where capacity had to go into overseas markets. We might be able to front more of that locally, which is good news for us. The risk accumulation, really a challenge still. So the urban centres and the potential for major losses still very much remain as we again struggle on those things up front. So all in all, we still have a worsening trend around the core systemic risk drivers and the weather influencing factors. This talks to local municipalities, service delivery, fire protection services, water management, drainage management, all impacted with fire and flood. So I think on the good side, risk is exploding. On the good side, never before, we continue to say this, do we have an opportunity to impact our clients and add real value? So lots of positive things we can talk about, but it is becoming more expensive for our clients. We are privatizing risk services. There's no doubt that cost will roll through as a cost of doing business in a South African context. So we need to do it cleverly. We need to do it with a good intent to be in there for the long term for our clients and to deliver real value. That is it from my side. I'm going to stop sharing, and then maybe there's a quick time for some questions. I don't know, Barry, if you want to lead with the questions, or I don't know if Thulani, you'll ask them from your side.
Thanks, Andrew.
Hi, Sandra.
Thulani, if you could lead with the questions. I can't see the questions on my screen. So maybe Thulani, if you could help with that, please.
Hi, Barry, I'm here. So I think the information you were sharing, people were so focused on what you were saying, there aren't questions sitting in the Q&A box at the moment. Oh, wait, here we go. I think there is something coming through now. Just apologize. Oh, it's an essay. It's just a pity you can't. I'm going to publish that. Are you able to see it if I publish it, Andrew? Can you see the Q's and Q&As?
Not yet.
Okay. Let's just see.
I can also, Sandra, in the interest of time, maybe I'm very happy if there are some questions that come through. If you can collate them and send them to me, I'm happy to answer them and send them back to yourself, and then you can share them. So I am also conscious that, that maybe we are under time pressure if it's hard to share. It's really been good as an opportunity to spend some time with everybody. May I wish you very good holidays if you're going to have some holidays coming up now in April into Easter. It's really good to be back in the industry again. And again, reach out to me as well anytime. Look forward to touching base with many of you. And Sandra, thank you to the opportunity for the FIA. Barry, Henriette, it's really nice to be able to share this platform with our brokers. Thank you very much. Really value the support.
Thank you, Andrew. Henriette, I'm not sure if there's any questions or anything from your side, or Barry.
No, I mean, we did get the comments now in the question box. I mean, this is really sketching the landscape to just say, oh, we're doing something from a governance point of view, because I mean, there is real risk in the industry and it's difficult. Everything is actually passed on to our clients. So I think that's almost the challenge that we're seeing here in a nutshell. And I think that is a complexity, because I mean, government also needs to change, but then almost everything falls on our client. And how do you find that balance? Because sometimes all that cost ends up at our end client, and that becomes a challenge from a broker and client point of view, Andrew.
No, I completely agree. We need to be more innovative. We need to own back that space of making a difference for our clients in a different way. The traditional insurance products at a higher and higher premium can't be the answer. Hence the shift to risk management, hence the shift to value. But if I can just say, whilst everything falls on our client, it also means that as an advisor and as an intermediate value chain, the shift to direct, which is just about product and price, related to the shift for value and more than insurance, plays back into our hands as the intermediate sector. We need to focus more, in my mind, on industry sectors. We need to do more outside of the insurance claim and the insurance policy around working with our clients to understand their risk needs. So it talks to a whole different approach to surveys. It talks to a whole different approach to assessment management and how we can broaden that value chain, add more meaningful value to our clients. If we get that right, we should bring down the cost of premiums, spread the cost of the insurance premium across more resilient, and make a real impact to our clients. So we can't take away the fact that risk is exploding and that it is tougher to do business, but we can move in alongside our clients and showcase real value in a way that hasn't been experienced before, that really makes the intermediary and the intermediate insurer show up differently. 2035 is not far away, but I do think the market in that space will have evolved. There'll be winners and losers, but I think we have an opportunity to take it back with new ideas, fresh insight, getting back into the faces of our clients, and really adding value around that advice and risk management space.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew. We appreciate that.
So, Sandra, could I just add to that? So Andrew, you're talking the talk that we have been talking in the FIA for a little while now, and it also talks to one of our concerns, and that is the sustainability of the intermediated model. In terms of if we are just thinking about, and if our clients are just thinking that insurance is the solution, I think we're on the wrong track. And I think we're going to have to, I think we always have to bear in mind, no matter what the market conditions, the intermediary there needs to get out of the box and start thinking wider on behalf of the client. Because in terms of the expectation of client of advice from the intermediary is very exposed. And just to support this, the FIA, we've developed it, but just looking now for a delivery mechanism, is a whole series of risk management modules, which starts from the principles of risk management. And thereby we're talking about, say, the pillars of risk transfer. And that doesn't necessarily mean that in the soft market, it was easy to find an insurer to carry the risk. What we're now saying is that insurance should be one of the pillars of risk transfer. So we're working on that, and we will be hoping to introduce that in the next month or so to all the members. There are 4 modules. We're going to have experts from IRMSA, the likes of Michael Duncan and a few other industry experts, all participating in this project, which then talks to what you've been saying and what Henriette has been saying, that I think, and the message is, as brokers, we are very exposed to the nuances of the market, and we need to find solutions. If there are no solutions, well, that is when we then need to be having the other conversation with clients to say, so, okay, what next? What can we then best do together with the client in a partnership to best mitigate those risks? So I'll leave it there for the moment. But I think it follows the theme, and I'm sure Johan and Werner will be talking to that as well. Thanks.
Fully agree on my side as well. Thanks, Barry.
Thank you so much. Thank you again, Andrew, for the time. Really, really appreciate your insights and sharing with us. And we'll look at all the questions. As we said, we'll share, and then we can always put together a more comprehensive document for our members post this event. But thank you again.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. And now I know Barry had already introduced in his opening Johan and Werner. So without any further ado, Johan, I'm going to hand over to you and to Werner to take us through the next stages. And I don't know if there's any 1 or 2 points from Henriette or Barry before we start with you. No, I think we've covered where we want to go with this, and we've had initial discussions. So the floor is yours, Johan and Werner, and thank you again so much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much, Sandra and Barry and Henriette. I think I just want to add to what Andrew is saying. Very informative presentation. And he touched on a few things that we will also be looking at, some case studies. But there's urgency. Especially what Barry said now is to make the insureds one of the pillars of the risk transfer or risk management. There's urgency. There's a huge element of urgency. If I can add that to the discussion. But anyway, I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see that? Can everybody see that?
Yes, perfect. Thanks, Johan.
Right, perfect. So I think what we are suggesting with this presentation is perhaps something that can be a solution. We constantly work for the last 6 years when things are going wrong, and we do the forensic investigations. But this year, it is one of my passions to use this last 6 years of lessons learned and turn it into a proactive educational tool and give it back to the insurance industry and our entire client base. And this is why I'm very pleased to have this opportunity. And I don't want to waste a lot of time, but I'm just quickly going to introduce myself to those who don't know me yet. So my name is Johan van der Heever. I'm the head of EFI Global Africa. We started out 1 July 2019 in South Africa. We're part of an international footprint. Our big brother sits in the US. So we've got the Americas, we've got Europe, Middle East, and Africa. We are Africa. Myself and Werner cover Africa. And then there's Asia Pacific. So EFI Global, just for quick background, is part of a global picture. So a lot of what we see in the South African and African space, we also get educational influence from our international colleagues, a lot of webinars. And yeah, I'm in my 41st year of being in the fire industry. My largest component of my career was forged in municipal fire services. I was a fire chief of a metropolitan service when I left in 2007. I then joined the insurance industry, was there for about 6 years, and then worked in the fire consultancy space and started EFI Global 1 July 2019. It was a one-man operation at that stage. Currently, today, we are 19. And I'm proud to share the platform with Werner, who will introduce himself to you as well. So yeah, that's just a quick overview of myself. Werner.
Thank you, Johan. Let me just unmute myself. Good morning, everyone, and it's such a privilege to be with you. My name is Werner Sieberg. I'm lead forensic engineer. Just briefly on my history, I spent about 10 years at Eskom being a forensic or investigations engineer in distribution up in Limpopo. Then also got some very nice exposure at the major technical investigations and assurance and forensics, doing some nice power station and particularly the Medupi Unit 4 investigation, which I'm very proud to have been a part of. And then also for a brief while, I actually served as senior engineer of quality of supply, and that has all to do with harmonics. I'll briefly touch on that also in my presentation. But yes, in a nutshell, I am somebody that likes to ask why until I can't anymore. I think I share that passion with many other forensic professionals. It is something I love doing, and yeah, look forward to sharing with you a bit later.
Right, so perfect. So thank you, Werner. So the topics that we will be looking at is just a couple of things that we'll be setting the stage with. Andrew touched on thatched risks, and one note I made when you also spoke about the climate, very few owners of thatched roof buildings realize that when it's a very drought period or dry period of drought, their roofs, being a cellulose plant material, is actually also adversely affected by that impact of drought, and not just the vegetation around the building, but the actual roof of the building. So it shortens the lifespan of the roof, and it makes the roof, renders the roof more easily ignitable and combustible. We're going to touch on some thatch risk examples and case studies. Cold rooms, we will be talking about that as well, and photovoltaic solar systems, and the small-scale embedded generation part. And I think you can see on the right there a photograph I took not too long ago of a site that I was at, and somebody said there, in case of a fire, do not use the elevator, use water. So yeah, so we specialize as EFI Global in post-loss, but we also offer a pre-loss specialty consulting service, which I will be talking a little bit more about at the end. And I feel that that's where the link is between what we see post-loss and what we can give back to our clients, including insurers, insureds, and intermediaries, the link between the two. So I'm just going to rush quickly through this. Those for you, if you don't know who EFI Global is, we've got a website, efiglobal.com. You're welcome to have a look at our global footprint there. But Africa is our territory. We belong to Sedgwick. Most of you should be familiar with Sedgwick. As you can see there, Sedgwick recently had a brand change. So we are wholly owned by Sedgwick internationally, but we operate as an independent, impartial forensic investigation and risk management product. We work separately to the Sedgwick platform. We work on our own business administration, and we do our own reporting and our peer reviews. We work globally for the judicial system. So our aim is to produce work that can stand the test of time in a courtroom environment. That's not always what our client is asking for. So there's various ways of reporting certain things to the merits of a certain situation, but we will never ever speculate or guess on anything. Now, I just want to touch on that a little bit just now. But just to get the elephant out the room, we belong to Sedgwick globally, but we are impartial and independent. We take case instruction from, believe it or not, from competition loss adjusters out there in the market who are not Sedgwick aligned. We get direct instructions from insurers. We do work for insureds even, and we do work for intermediaries or brokers stroke advisors. Right, so we offer 4 main products. Fire and explosion investigations is what we launched it on. The specialty consulting I've just mentioned. Barry mentioned the environmental specialist services, and obviously Werner is in the forensic engineering space. This information, you can see it on our website. I'm just going to repeat it, efiglobal.com, and I'm not going to go through the points just for time's sake, but there's an easy to reach email address, forensicsa@efiglobal.com. And the environmental space. What's maybe important to mention on the environmental side, waste beneficiation and environmental law consulting. When a loss has occurred and insurers are sitting with 20,000 tons of rice, we come up with all sorts of innovative ideas as to how to turn not just a salvage scenario or a solution, but to actually re-beneficiate the product that was damaged into a new stream. And there's a lot of case studies. We've got about 15 case studies where we have turned a claim or a loss into a profit for the insured and insurers. And we would love to share that information with you at some point in time. It's very interesting. Forensic engineering, basically high level, it's root cause failure analysis. There's investigations that Werner and his team are doing in terms of mechanical failures, machinery breakdown, electrical issues. And as Werner said, power generation is just one component of what we use in our industrial occupancies or domestic occupancies. There's distribution, there's interface with consumption and distribution. And very often the question is asked, where does the COC start and end? And that is in itself another massive presentation that we would like to sink our teeth into at some point. So specialty consulting, and this is where we're saying is the link between post-loss and pre-loss. So all of our team are documenting losses that have occurred, and we are collecting a lot of information. And with our background and career experience, we see potential to plow this back. And here's just a couple of examples where we can really drill into the compliance with national building regulations, fire protection systems. Andrew mentioned the topic of sprinklers. It's one of my most favorite topics, and I will gladly present on that as well on a future date. Compliance assessments with portable and fixed fire equipment, electrical compliance, environmental legislative compliance, health and safety, if there's recovery possibilities, if there's any third-party liability, tailored risk assessments and risk surveys. There's a couple of examples where that has happened on the back of a loss that have occurred on a very complex plant area that was affected, but insurers want to know what is the rest of the plant and facility, the status. And we've done a lot of work in terms of assessing the risk overall. Fire scar mapping and satellite imagery, that's spread of fire, and Andrew briefly touched on fire breaks, which is another very, very interesting topic to talk about. I cannot continue without this slide. So what is a risk? A risk is a likelihood of something happening multiplied by the consequence. And there's a frequency to this, how it fluctuates. And I know I'm talking to an audience that's well educated in this field, but I always look at this word here, residual risk. And how do we identify that residual risk in terms of our frequency? There's a famous brand filling station, 2 o'clock in the morning, there's no pumping of fuel. The fuel is on the ground in the tanks. Now one car drives in. So now we're dispensing fuel. You can see the number of pumps. So if all the pumps are pumping, our risk profile has changed. The tanker arrives to replenish the underground tanks for the filling station. So again, a different risk. And how do we understand the cycle of this risk, and how do we handle it and manage that risk? Fire is an old problem or peril. Ken McLean, our CEO of Sedgwick, visited London recently, and he sent me this photograph, the Great Fire of London. This is apparently the spot where it broke out. It was eventually discovered that it was the King's baker. He had a fire in his house, and he thought he had put the fire out, but it actually then led to the Great Fire of London, 1666. And I think all of you will tell me in detail that this is also sort of the spot where insurance was born. The irony of this whole lot is it happened in Pudding Lanes. So I'm just sharing a little something with you. Okay, so let's drill into fire safety and related legislation. I had to stop with this list because this is what I quickly compiled. The list can carry on, but I think the idea of showing you this list is to say, we need to understand that there's a very, very long list of legislation in South Africa. A lot of this is prescriptive. A lot of the legislation is regulatory. But how do we navigate? And that's the word that I found for me as a key word in today's topic for this session. How do we navigate through? We've got all these acts and standards and everything, but how do we navigate through it that is tailor-made and tailor-fit for the risk that we're dealing with, and that we can place with insurers? And as Andrew has said, how will they then manage that risk, or take hands with the intermediaries and the insured to manage this? But I mean, just look at this list. You can see even the Road Traffic Act has got elements of fire protection in it. I would love to see a single fire code for South Africa. We do a lot of work in Mauritius. Mauritius, believe it or not, a small island, they've got a fire code. And the fire code is one holistic go-to document in easy to understand terms for everybody to understand how all of this fits together. Hopefully in my next 40 years in the industry, I'll be able to come up with a fire code for us to work with. Right, so it all comes down to the National Building Regulations, which is gazetted in 1990 and 1991 by Government Gazette number 12780 and 13054. And that's basically the 5 concepts that we see over here. Excuse me a second. So any building shall be so designed, constructed and equipped, and let's say operated, that in the case of a fire, it's the safety of the occupants. B, we minimize the intensity and spread of the fire. C, we ensure sufficient stability for that structure. The generation and spread of smoke is minimized, and there's adequate means of access and equipment for detecting, fighting, controlling, and extinguishing such fire. And Andrew also touched on fire detection and using telematics and all sorts of intelligence systems for us to have early warning. So the takeaway from this particular slide is to say that the National Building Regulations, it's in an act, the National Building Regulations and Building Standards Act, Act 103 of 1977. And it has a lot of normative references, and there's an endless list of SANS codes that also has major components that deals to fire protection and fire safety. And there I've just listed a number of them. These ones specifically appear as normative references. That means they link to the regulations, which is the regulations of the Act, which means it's compulsory, it shall be complied with. So again, the word navigation comes to mind. How do we navigate through this? There you see it on the list, sprinklers. We see it there. Thermal insulation material, SANS 4 to 8. Huge issues that we find post-loss with thermal insulation on the underside of warehouse roofing and complex industrial occupancies, thermal insulation materials. There at the bottom, Occupational Health and Safety Act. Major hazard installation regulations. When are these regulations triggered? So the local authorities write out a flammable substance certificate, but they're only authorized to do it up for certain classes of substances. So other classes will trigger the MHI regulations. So we do a lot of forensic work, and we come across sites where we then conclude with, hang on, this site, if it was registered as the MHI, the loss potentially could have been prevented or much smaller than what actually happened. The general safety regulations. Hot works is another big hot potato, hot works, hot topic. Hazardous chemical agents is also regulations in the Health and Safety Act. So yeah, we need to navigate, we need to understand the law of the land for the history of the building, but also for the process conducted in that building. And right at the bottom of that slide, already there's another 2024 edition of SANS 10400 Part T that has been published last year. A very interesting component in that document is a section called design stacks. And that just, I can present 1 hour just on design stacks, but on a high level, they've basically reintroduced what was written into the deemed to satisfy rules in 1990. Which was later then written out with reference to the standard for sprinklers for your stacking heights. Now the table is again reintroduced back into Part T in 2024, telling you the actual stacking heights for various occupancy classes. So how to navigate through all of this, very, very interesting. Post-loss, I don't think I need to spend too much time on this. But yeah, EFI Global, we are there to assist with any stage, pre-loss and post-loss. We spoke about waste beneficiation. So yeah, quickly, I think some of you have seen this slide before. If a fire breaks out, something has to happen. Somebody needs to see the fire breaking out, or the system needs to detect the fire. A call needs to be taken through to the call-taking center. Somebody needs to answer the phone on that side. They need to trigger the nearest emergency service. That crew needs to get to their apparatus. They need to find the route to get to the location where the fire is. And there's a SANS code actually that tells us how to do this, SANS 10090. And a very interesting part of 10090 is weight and speed of response. So even local authority, municipal fire services know how to render this service. And they also touched on it, the failing situation with local authorities, and there I put it at the bottom there. There's a lot of questions. Local authority involvement, building control officer, what's their role? Compliance and approval, who approved what at what point in the lifetime of the building? While the fire engine is responding and somebody is trying to do something, we've got passive and active fire protection systems and people trying to do first aid firefighting in the buildings. Right, so what is fire? Fire is a rapid oxidation process under certain circumstances. Fire dynamics is a study of fire behavior. A fire area is very prominently distinguished between where damage didn't occur and fire damage occurred. And don't listen to people who say to you that where there is the most fire damage is where the seat and the origin of the fire is. That is expectation bias, and we must avoid expectation bias at all costs. So if a proper expert forensic fire investigator will document all of these aspects in a fire investigation report. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. there's the three elements: fuel, heat, oxygen. Together under favorable circumstances, you have a chain reaction. So to extinguish a fire, remove oxygen. So there are systems, gaseous suppression systems that can do that. Or heat, you put wet stuff on the hot stuff, sprinkler systems, handheld fire equipment. Fuel, or you remove the fuel out of the building, or you build firewalls to segregate or separate fuel from getting involved. Quick chemistry lesson. Methane, that's your most elementary carbon that you find in nature. So that's a carbon with 4 hydrogens. If you oxidize the carbon, you get CO2 and H2O. H2O, that's interesting. It's water is a product of combustion. We call it complete combustion. So ethane is the one up, C2H6. So now that becomes complicated, because if you add oxygen to the equation, oxidize the carbon particle, you now have carbon monoxide and H2O plus carbon. And that C, carbon, is where we then have a lot of toxic agents, smoke and soot deposits, and contamination of sophisticated equipment, sophisticated plant and machinery that gets contaminated. There's just a list of toxic substances. And where we find a lot of this contamination is obviously where the fire happened in one part of a complex building, but the smoke traveled throughout. The smoke was never ventilated quickly to the exterior of the building, and it affects and contaminates a lot of sophisticated machinery, electronic apparatus and equipment. Human beings, pathways of poisoning. I don't need to spend a lot of time on that, but we know that it's toxic to our bodies and we die from exposure to fire. Preparation is key, and you can't do an in loco walk around the building and call it where the fire started. You need to be prepared and decontaminate and be ready to dig in and do a forensic investigation, gather data, and have it analyzed. So I'm just going to share this quick video with you. It's just to highlight how unpredictable or predictable a fire is. So basically, these guys are demonstrating to bystanders how a fire behaves. And the person lighting the fire underestimated what the vapor air mixture is going to do. So if you look at the slow motion, invisible to the human sensors, sensory organs, maybe smell, and then the fear and the fright that they get, and they throw the fuel onto bystanders. So the question is, fire is actually totally unpredictable. And we always say that it's not an exact science. There's always something new to learn every single time we do a forensic investigation. Right, so we just quickly want to talk about flashover. And the reason why I talk about this is flashover is defined as a fire in a room becoming a room on fire. And this is how we can mitigate or prevent major losses. If a fire can be ventilated to the exterior of this room with sufficient ventilation mechanisms and suppression, we will prevent flashover. So flashover is where all the contents of the room now become involved in the fire. And as you can see from the diagram there, the chair caught fire. The heat that builds up on the underside of the ceiling forms a heat layer. That heat layer temperature increases. Very, very quickly you can reach 600 degrees Celsius in that heat layer. The radiation heat from that heat layer projects onto the contents of the room. It raises the combustibles to the auto ignition temperature, and as you see bottom right, all those items then suddenly burst into flame. That's the moment of flashover, and we want to intervene and prevent flashover from happening. I'm going to play this video Just a brief video. Look at the clock at the bottom right-hand side. It's a tree in the corner catching flame. Look at the flame, the jet on impingement on the ceiling. Obviously, these flames will cause very specific fire patterns on the walls and on the ceiling. Give some attention to the couch and the lamp and the chest of drawers. You can see the smoke and the pyrolysis taking place, the heat layer dropping down, and drop down materials. The carpet is starting to steam. The carpet catches fire. Look at the stopwatch, 33 seconds, 34 seconds. And there's no ways that a human being will survive such an outbreak of fire. That was a simulation, but I mean, we can all equate to that room. Even our bedrooms can behave similarly. Right, so fire is always temperature time dependent. So the trick will be to prevent ignition to occur, and that's what a lot of stringent risk improvement requirements from insurers are always about. Risk surveyors going through buildings. When we do risk assessments, we want to prevent ignition from happening, and we want to then obviously separate ignition sources from flammables and combustibles. So that's very tricky and not always a very simple solution. And that is again where we need to take hands with insureds. They operate their buildings, they occupy their buildings, they know their processes. But when ignition occurs, there we go. We've got a heat release rate that starts to develop. There's a growth graph, and then that flash over, as you can see on the dark or the black background graph. So on the right, you can see when there's intervention from systems, we actually slice the head off this growth graph, and we prevent a fire from breaking out or flashover from happening. If there's time-years intervention by a sprinkler system, and the sprinkler system is not overwhelmed by the fire load, then we can actually prevent flashover with the concurrent and carefully coordinated extraction of the superheated gases and smoke from that warehouse or that building. We can prevent flashover. Right. I'm just going to play this video. This is in the food industry. It starts to talk a little bit about thermal insulation and cold rooms. So it's you can see the floors are clean. You can eat off the floors literally. And a lot of the times we see it in survey reports. Surveyors will say the floors are clean. You can eat off the floors as a way of describing their first impression. Just give your attention to the deep fryer that happens over here. There's a person walking on that mixer working on the mixer on the left, and there's a person on the right. But see what happens. It's a deep fryer, and if you see what happens, there's pyrolysis taking place, which means there's thermal runaway in that deep frying. There's the auto ignition temperature of the oil is reached, and now look what happens. First person decide to throw the water on, and immediately you've got a fire that's totally out of control. The second person that was under that canopy also decides to throw water and run, and you saw the second sort of spill on the floor there. So we can talk a long time just about that reaction that happened over there, throwing water on a very hot oil fire. Explosion. An explosion is potential energy that sits there, and under certain circumstances, that potential energy, chemical or mechanical, turns into kinetic energy, and it releases gases under pressure, and that gases then do mechanical work, like demolishing buildings or blowing up pressure vessels, or just if the pressure vessel itself, the integrity of it or the tensile of it is no longer able to contain the pressure of the gas it's holding, it ruptures or it tears, and it causes what we call high order damage. There's other terminologies here: backdraft, detonation, and deflagration. Detonation is, for instance, where the flame front moves through unburnt material faster than the speed of sound. That's detonation. deflagration is where it moves subsonic. This is a video that I actually just created some snips from, just to shorten our time a bit. But this is a nice illustration of a LPG vessel. We've got a lot of our insureds have these vessels on their premises, and they use LP gas or other gases, hydrogen, as a fuel source. I'm not going to play the video, but I've created some still images. So what you see here is, while the vessel is full, the contents actually help in cooling. So say a fire breaks out around the vessel, and there's fire and flame impingement on the vessel, the contents actually help cool the vessel and help protect the vessel. As you can see there in the middle, it reaches a point where there's a pressure buildup inside the vessel, and the pressure release mechanism activates. The pressure safety valve activates, and with continued flame and fire impingement on the vessel, and the more it releases the contents, the level of the flammable liquid lowers. And now if you look at top right, there's a glowing section of that vessel, and the cooling or the heat transfer from the vessel to the contents can no longer occur, because there's a space that is opened, the level has dropped. And if you look at the next couple of photographs, that is then what we call a boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion, a BLEVE, or a tear of the vessel, and there's an immediate release of the contents, which is under pressure, that white cloud. Then it follows by a flaming ignition of the contents and a white cloud ignition, and that whole pressure vessel becomes a missile. This video is a few minutes long, but I think you get the gist of it. So how to prevent this is to not have combustibles and flammables so close to your vessel, number one. Number two, have early detection and suppression systems to protect and cool that vessel, even if the fire is not involving the vessel. But defensive strategy would be to activate a deluge or a sprinkler system to cool the vessel and prevent this from ultimately happening to that pressure vessel. Boiler explosions. This person, as you can see on the bottom right, seconds before the boiler exploded, he was actually starting up that boiler and it exploded. This video, I'm not going to play it. I'm going to go through it just for time's sake. It's a chemical factory. When we enter into debate with our colleagues in the sprinkler industry, they say, but hang on, yeah, you can see the whole building is ventilating. So what's the use of ventilation systems? Sprinkler systems are better. Then we say, but hang on, if we could ventilate the superheated gases and smoke and limit the number of sprinkler heads that activates in the process, we wouldn't have this picture playing out. So it's a very powerful, very hot debate that the two industries actually have. And I'm part of that debate. I've been part of it for about 40 years now. Quick example, a laundromat. The lady takes the towels out of the laundry, of the tumble dryer, puts it in the laundry basket, puts it down on the counter. Look at the timeline just quickly there. You'll see it was just before closing time, 16:25. Later that night, 20:46, the smoldering fire. You can clearly see the shape where the basket was. The camera was smoke locked, but you can clearly see the flame impingement, and you can see the fire spreading. And to investigate a fire like this is very fascinating and very interesting to understand the ignition sequence that occurred there. Over and above some of my investigations in Africa and Mauritius, I was fortunate to conduct this investigation in Northern Ireland, in Belfast. The person, domestic fire, they bought the air fryer, and when I arrived at this premises, I could see that there was a lot of call it a chaotic scenario with kiddies and a lot of toys, and it was the dad's turn to cook, and he put food in the air fryer, but he put it on the gas stove, and when we reconstructed the ignition sequence, he then realized, oh, he made a mistake by putting the air fryer on the gas stove. He had the pot going in the background. So yeah.
Johan, sorry to
Yes.
bug you. I know we're running out of time. So if you can
Yes.
wrap up your part, that we can hand over to Werner, if you don't mind, I would appreciate that.
Right, perfect. I'm going to skip to my slides. Werner could talk about this one, lightning conduction on thatch, direct lightning strike, and this thatch was treated with fire retardant. As you can see, there's a conductor system just to the right of that. I'm going to skip to this part. This is the proverbial needle in a haystack scenario. Multiple thatch structures lost. We use satellite images to map a fire scar. Andrew touched on this thermal runaway between different buildings and occupancies. And this is an interesting case study. Why did one building remain standing when the rest of them burned down? The needle in the haystack there, fire scar mapping, we use at least 5 satellites to do this. There you can see standard construction building standing, but the thatch building well alight. This is one of my biggest non-standard construction fire investigations I've conducted in Mauritius, 800 million resort, and it was hot works, thatch roofs, thatch roof fire, and it comes down to the design. The architect had particular things in the design of the building, which at the time of the fire incident was not in place. Fire spread much faster upwards on an incline. Thatch building burned down in Simonstown. Some risk management, housekeeping, agricultural housekeeping. Arson, the skirting tested positive for paraffin, but it took a trained eye from one of the EFI Global Fire team to spot that one. Lab analysis, sprinkler failure. We did a calculation as to what the ideal scenario would have been versus what the outcome was. As you can see there, some problems that was happening with the sprinkler system. Some lessons learned with thermal imaging, stacking heights, absence of housekeeping. We're running through composite panels, polystyrene, polyethylene, polyurethane, electric arc was found on. And just lastly, quickly before I go to Werner, this is a cold room where a sprinkler system was actually mounted on the roof of the cold room. So the weight is borne by the cold room itself. And that is totally illegal in terms of normative references and standards for the industry. Right. Finishing off my part, a forensic investigation has 7 steps. You've got to do all 7 steps to do a proper forensic investigation. You cannot jump from step 3, where you've collected data, to have a final hypothesis. You need to conduct all 7 steps. Right. Level of certainty and level of confidence is what it's all about. Over to Werner.
Thank you, Johan. Just cognizant of time, Henriette, just a quick one on, do I play this presentation? And, when you play your WhatsApp voice notes on twice the speed, do we do that? Or do I try to do this in 10 minutes? Can we perhaps go a bit over time? I'm not sure whether the audience, I just want to respect the audience in that regard.
I think if we go slightly over time, I think it's okay. I think let's give it a go as far as possible.
I'll try my best, and I'm going to set my timer for 20 minutes. There is a red thing that's going to go red and show me when I'm going a bit over time, but I'm seeing from the audience that there is appetite to just spend a bit more time on this. Right, so I'm going to speak about, firstly, PV solar systems, solar PV systems. I have shared this presentation before with the Insurance Institute. I trust that there will be some of the delegates that have already seen this presentation. And for you, I trust that today will be a fresh look on this, and perhaps you've thought about it in the interim. Just a brief overview of a solar PV system. You've got the sunlight that hits the solar panels. I think most of you guys will know this. The solar panels then generate a DC current, a direct current, which will then be fed into an inverter. Sometimes it's fed directly into a charge controller or an MPPT module. In this illustration, it's not there. The hybrid inverter then very often connects to batteries. Sometimes the charge controller connects to the batteries directly. And then the inverter obviously feeds the house together with the electric utility, which all flows through the meter. So the meter is also quite an important discussion point, which I'll touch on a bit later. We are moving towards smart meters, where metering is not only in one direction. Remember, historically, it was from the electric utility through the meter and to the house. We are now going into, and I think specifically when we're going to talk about the SSEG discussion, smart meters actually enable the export of power onto the grid. And it's been a discussion in this country for a very long time. Right, so inverters convert between AC and DC power. When you've got a rectifier within an inverter, which is generally the case for a hybrid inverter, you can also convert back from AC to DC power, not just from DC to AC. So that is then called a rectifier, and with that DC power, you can charge your batteries. An inverter has just a lot of different specifications, but the most important of which are voltage and current ratings, nominal and maximum. And that obviously relates to the heat generation rate of the inverter. The inverter is not a perfect converter. So there's some heat generated while you convert from DC to AC. That has to do with the switches that you're working with, which are obviously diode based in most instances. And so an inverter has an efficiency, an inherent efficiency. And most inverters are, in the high 90s in terms of efficiency, in terms of, being able to produce, take one type of power converter to another at a very high efficiency, and the losses are subsequently low. And I think one of my pet peeves in the industry is the fact that, we've got different interconnected circuits. Sorry, Johan, can you just go a slide back, please? Different interconnected parts of a solar PV system. The cables are very often also a critical and safety critical part of that. So for cables, we've also got voltage and current ratings, the joints and terminations, which is a problem in solar PV installations, but also in general electrical installations. Just to make those joints and terminations properly in terms of SUNS 10142. We've got combiner boxes, which basically contain the fuses that protect these solar panels and also protect the installation, which basically are DC based. And then we've got batteries. We're going to talk a bit about batteries in a while. The power rating, or the rate of discharge and the rate of charge, is very important and also differs for different battery technologies. We can have a depth of discharge, which basically relates to how far you can discharge a battery from 100% state of charge. We've got internal protection systems that form basically an integral part of all battery systems these days. And those BMS systems basically manage voltage, current, and temperature of the cells and of the battery itself. And then we're going to talk a bit about the chemistry, lithium ion, as well as lead acid. Thank you, Johan. Right, also integrated into not only electrical installations, but also PV systems as a circuit breaker or protection systems in general. These have a voltage, a current rating, and also a characteristic curve. In other words, circuit breakers need to be coordinated with each other. So the main circuit breaker, for example, in very simplistic terms, will be a 60 amp breaker in most instances. Your smaller light circuits will be protected by a 20 amp, and your sockets perhaps by 16 amp circuit breakers. And then also different types of protection, which is not just necessarily related to circuit breakers, is electrical earthing and bonding. That is very important also for human safety and is dealt with extensively in SUNS 10142. We've got lightning protection and shielding, which probably has 6 or 7 standards that I know of that deal specifically with lightning protection of buildings as well as the human aspect thereof. And these standards refer extensively to surge protection and surge arresters. Those surge arresters have a protection level, which is essentially the voltage that that will be clamped to if the current through the surge arrestor stays below the nominal current rating, or the IN. And that is very important for lightning forensic investigations, which I do quite a lot of. Thanks, Johan. You can carry on. Right. So just coming to the technical causes, generally, and for the majority of electrical fires that we encounter, inadequate joints and terminations are front and foremost. They occur most regularly. So loose connections heading to hot connections, and that is a basic non-compliance to SUNS 10142. There's a very specific clause that I can't remember right now. But inadequate thermal management is also a close second, leading to melting of insulation and then also subsequent ignition thereof in the presence of perhaps an electrical arc. The inadequate configuration, management, and settings of batteries. So this can lead to overcharging and thermal runaway. And this obviously has to do with the the integration, the system design of the solar PV system, which very often includes batteries. So if the BMS is not configured correctly, if the inverter doesn't talk to the BMS in the correct way, one can very quickly experience overcharging of cells. And that also talks to just inadequate system integration design. That's also just a big topic that I'm currently trying to grapple with, to trying to ensure that systems are designed in an integrated way, even the complex systems that we very often find in domestic and commercial applications. So I have found, and it is my opinion, obviously my professional opinion, that there is a lack of professional oversight during design, installation, and commissioning. I recently saw a news article that Professor Vali Pariachi is advocating heavily for professional sign-off on solar PV systems, although that will actually increase the cost thereof. My view is that it is a prudent cost to incur. I think we heard in the first presentation also on the need to actually mitigate the risks prudently and do so in an economically sustainable way. So this all leads to, or it comes from those root causes, right? So the lack of adequate testing and verification is also a root cause. And then just the skills and fundamental knowledge of electrical systems by electrical installers and electricians, specifically also green card holders. Just for the context, a green card is a 1 or 2 week course that I believe does not capacitate the person that passes it to be an electrical installation person. It's more over it's actually more the qualification as an electrician or as a registered person, installation electrician, that capacitates one to wire an installation correctly. You can go to the next slide, but just as a quick anecdote, so the fact that one is an electrical registered person does not mean that you're capacitated to actually design a prudent and a good system an integrated system. And that is, in my opinion, the purview of the engineer. All right. Just a brief discussion on why lead-acid batteries have been traditionally used, but are in recent times being replaced by lithium. The energy density of lithium is about 10 times higher per kilogram. So the energy density is much higher. You can discharge them much deeper. So you can only discharge a lead acid to about 50%. You can discharge them much more, so many more times. The cycle life is a lot more. The capacity degradation has to do with lithium plating in lithium batteries. Specifically, we'll talk a bit about that now. And it refers to sulfation in lead acid batteries, which is a much more severe type of degradation. The environmental footprint is also a consideration that has led to this migration, the lead being a toxic metal. The charge rates, also how quickly you can extract power from a lithium battery, is much quicker than as opposed to a lead acid battery. The C value refers to the how quickly you can do that. The charge and discharge rate, obviously. So basically, lithium ion batteries cost less per usable cumulative kilowatt hour. Remember, the cumulative refers to discharge it this many times and this deeply. So it's an integral. So basically, lithium batteries are just way better. But there are obviously some risks associated with them, and we'll deal with them in the next slide, I think. Right, so lithium battery degradation, and we can have a whole chemistry lesson on this. I don't think it's prudent to discuss the intricacies of the chemistry. What we need to know is that in a lithium battery, there is obviously a separator material between the cathode and the anode to prevent a short circuit. And there is a high resistance region that builds up in the, let's call it the central region, which leads to depleted region of lithium at the anode and leads to excessive lithium regions on the top and the bottom, and leads to metal plating. The lithium metal actually plates to the anode. So this obviously results in a reduction in the migration of lithium ions through the separator material and through the electrolyte. You can go to the next one, but it is a process of the natural aging of the lithium. Now, when overcharging occurs or over discharging occurs, it leads to excessive lithium plating, and what one now sees here is dendrites, and it's a very sharp, almost piercing part of at the anode, and it pierces through the separator material and to the cathode. Now, what happens then is that you're basically creating a short circuit because the anode and the cathode are intrinsically at different potentials, at different voltages, and that's what makes up the battery. So as soon as these dendrites, because of the overcharging, reach the cathode, there is a short circuit, and because of that short circuit, obviously, there is a localized short circuit, and it's a short circuit current that flows. That short circuit current creates a lot of heat and basically results in thermal runaway. I think, Johan, you can carry on to the next one. Right, so the formation of lithium oxide, there is a chemical formula that I'm not going to describe now, but it basically results in a red tinged flame. It's highly exothermic. I've even given you the enthalpy of combustion there. And then the formation of lithium hydroxide, which is the hydrolysis from lithium oxide. It's also exothermic. So there are two exothermic reactions which very often occur concurrently. What also then forms this hydroxide, it's a very strong base, or it's an alkaline solution, which leads to a lot of corrosion. So when we get to a fire scene, very often we see that the metal parts of the surrounding electrical installation have actually corroded quite a bit. And that's a result of the stuff that gets released into, the atmosphere that deposits on metallic surfaces. Right, just the health effects of lithium hydroxide. Sorry, just go back one more. Right, so it can create chemical burns on the skin and eyes, so because of its alkaline nature. And then also inhalation can cause lung and respiratory irritation, coughing, long-term damage, and that's basically because of the reaction of the lithium oxide with the water in your body as you breathe it in. Right, thank you. Right, then nitrogen is obviously also quite abundant in the air that we breathe, and so the formation of lithium nitride is also quite common. It's highly exothermic, this reaction. This is just a quick picture of what it looks like. But then the formation of ammonia and lithium hydroxide from that is also quite important. Ammonia itself has a very toxic and suffocating odor and is also highly alkaline and corrosive. So there are two substances that are formed from the combustion or the burning of a lithium battery that are not good for people standing around, and are also highly exothermic, which results in the burning of that lithium battery and the thermal runaway that we speak of. Thank you, Johan. Right, so preventing thermal runaway. This is obviously what we like to talk about. I believe that sprinkler systems and ventilation, because the fire tetrahedron, you've basically got the fuel, you've got the heat, and you've got the oxygen in close proximity with each other with the lithium battery. It's very difficult to get the sprinkler or the cooling effects, or to remove the fuel is very difficult in the context of a very, very quick exothermic reaction. To me, as an engineer, the operative word is prevention. Adequate design, proper earthing, proper wiring, and also proper treatment of the batteries in terms of battery management systems. Right, so the charge and discharge rates are quite important, critically so. The manage of voltage and current into and out of each cell. So this talks to cell balancing in many aspects. And basically just to make sure that the batteries do not form dendrites on the inside. Ventilation and cooling to some extent is also important. We need to make sure that the batteries are not exposed to high temperatures, especially in the Northern Cape and those type of areas. So air cons are very often installed in those battery rooms. Physical damage, it's actually something I've dealt with quite recently, where you've got physical damage to a battery or a battery module that leads to the opening of the battery cells and leads to the leaking out of the electrolyte. And so once the electrolyte leaks out and the oxygen can come in, basically thermal runaway will follow. Right, so monitoring a battery for swelling is also quite important, where you can have access to the individual cells. All right, we can have the next slide. Right, and that was basically the talk on batteries. We're going to talk on small-scale embedded generation, which was a specific hot topic that you guys felt we should address. So I'm going to not talk about the legal aspects, which is a talk on its own. I'm going to talk specifically from the point of view of an engineer. The responsibility barrier, is it the point of supply, or otherwise the meter, or is the point of control, or your main DB, the main switch of your main DB, where you can switch off your electrical installation? That's a question that I'm going to leave in the room. It is actually sometimes the topic of debate. So the responsibility of the distributor, and I want to differentiate specifically between the distributor and the trader. Historically, the distributor and the trader has been Eskom or the municipalities. They've fulfilled both roles. But the responsibilities are basically to ensure the safety of the network and the operators, and to protect the quality of supply to all users of electricity. Now, let me just briefly stand still at this point. Obviously, there's been a raging public debate on the registration of, or the necessity to register these small-scale, domestic, in very, very many instances, solar PV systems, especially where they want to feed back into the system and sell power back to the utilities. Now, the safety aspect is dealt very often in the terms of just installing an anti-islanding device. That anti-islanding device will effectively isolate the small-scale embedded generation plant from the network whenever the main network is sensed to go down. In other words, there's an outage on the main feeder. However, such systems can fail. And where that is the case, the power that is then injected to the system, if that small-scale embedded generation is big enough, and if there is enough of them, that can actually result in the sustaining of the network post-isolation on the other side, so on the utility side. And that has natural and obvious consequences for operator safety. So if I'm an operator and I want to make sure that I can work on this cable, that I can make a joint when there's a cable fault, and I don't know how many other sources of power are actually connected to this cable on the other side, that can very quickly lead to fatalities and hospitalizations. So that is the reason, that is the physical or the technical reason why registration is important, and why also approval of the design is important. And also then to protect the quality of supply to all other users. So in other words, if there are two users on a system and the one injects power, along with the utility, of course, and injects a large amount of harmonics, and another user has got a very sensitive motor, for example, that is sensitive to harmonics, it will be detrimental to that other user if the utility accepts the harmonic, affected power, and then sells that same power to the other user. And so the custodian of the network has the responsibility to all users, and that is why very often I've found municipalities have required certain types of inverters, because they know that the harmonic injection or the harmonic content that will be produced by these inverters is below the regulatory limit, because the utility and even Eskom has to report to NERSA on the amount of harmonics, the amount of other quality supply parameters that basically pollute the network. Right. So that the power flow has historically been from the utility to premises loads. And the SSEG impact is, there's a couple of aspects there too. The protection and safety considerations. So we've spoken about the anti-islanding to preventing backfeed during outages. There's the harmonics. Right, and then we've got the network planning and grid stability concerns. So network planners at the utility side and at Eskom actually need to know how much power they have at their disposal. And this obviously talks to grid stability. We all know load shedding is a result of, or a preemptive reaction to, a threat to grid stability. And so that is very important. Infrastructure capital allocation. So for example, if I've got a big load center over here, I've got a source over here, I need to build a cable of a certain thickness and certain length. However, if I know that there is a small-scale embedded generation at the load center or near that load center, which is basically distributed generation, the cable doesn't have to be so thick, right? So capital allocation is then inefficient if you don't know where your distributed loads are. And then obviously for billing applications also, so we've all heard about the smart meters that can measure the flow of energy both ways, where your traditional meters were not able to do so. So utilities and municipalities, in effect, need to retain control of network parameters. That is their core function, and also need to comply with NERSA requirements themselves. And while this might be a big frustration, I think there needs to be a workable solution found. I think it's going to be a debate for some time. But I just thought I'd give the brokers specifically just a view just to inform their customers and their insureds of the technical reasons, and that they can always refer back to us and for clarity or further study in any specific risk context. That'll be really good. Johan, you can carry on. Right, so the small-scale embedded generation, obviously involving the engineer, I think that was also one of the burning questions, has been punted by various people in the industry and also in regulatory bodies. My view is that it is required anyway. So the identification of engineering work regulations, which have been gazetted and are published by EXA, actually require that complex systems are signed off by an engineer. And that has been a requirement even before this latest SSEG discussion. So we've got the future of electricity markets, which is something very exciting. I'm quite excited about that, the opening of the market in essence. So the generators historically have been Eskom, and IPPs have come along in the last 10 years or 15 years or so. The traders of electricity, you remember we talked about just traders and distributors. So traders always used to be just Eskom. And so traders have now been given approval by NERSA for trading licenses of energy aggregators. What that means basically is that a solar plant or a large-scale commercial solar plant doesn't necessarily have to contract only with one big mine in terms of selling them all their offtake. So all their energy that they produce gets taken by this mine, and they basically island themselves from Eskom. And So what happens now is there's a solar plant and they sell their electricity to aggregators. And those aggregators basically pay the distributor, which is National Transmission Company, which used to be Eskom Transmission, and they pay Eskom Distribution and the municipality a certain levy for the privilege or for the service of transporting the electrons from the power plant to the certain user. And they can basically, or they allege that they can do so more competitively and that the prices of electricity will come down as a result thereof. It is an exciting time to be alive indeed, and I look forward to further technical discussions, because obviously Eskom is not happy about this. It's basically going to destroy their market. So we are excited. I think there's growing pains that are going to happen in this space, but this also results in a more free market in terms of who can buy electricity from who, and yeah. So basically, the trader pays the generator or the IPP, the solar farm. The trader then pays the distributors the levy, and then the customer pays the the trader. So it's exciting. I'm not sure how this will develop, but we will see. And I think it also feeds into the whole discussion of the safety of the network. With large IPPs, they obviously have to apply to NASA and also to Eskom previously for the to just make sure that the plant is safe. So those regulatory requirements will in some degree be filtered down to domestic premises and commercial premises. And yeah, so just I think if you can take anything away from this is there is a reason why approval and registration of these systems is required, but I think it can be done in a very efficient way that doesn't add additional costs to people that want to install these systems. Thank you, Han.
Yeah, Werner, I think that's basically
that's the end of my presentation.
Yeah. For time's sake, I'm going to stop sharing now. Thank you, Henriette. There's a lot more that can be said, Barry and Sandra, on this topic. So I know time is always an issue. As you can hear, we're passionate about the topics, and we would really like to secure future opportunities to share the knowledge that we are sitting with. Somewhere somebody will benefit from it, and something positive can happen, and we have a desire to share that knowledge. Yeah, so over to Barry.
Thank you, Jan and Werner. I must say, just reading some of the comments, it's been a wow presentation. And so much that I think we've all learned, and so much more to learn. But very quickly, my takeaway to our members is we can't, as advisors, be expected to be all things to all people. And when we start talking about the subject we're talking about now, compliance, SSEG, whatever, let's not be afraid to consult with the experts. And I leave that as a takeaway. But Henriette, thanks, and Sandra as well. Thank you for putting this together. Great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yes, thank you, everybody. Apologies that we have run over, but I think by a show of hands, it was absolutely worth it to run a little bit over time to hear further into your presentation. Lots of requests for another session with you guys. So I'm going to lean on Henriette and our relationship, and let's see what we can put together for our members. But yeah, we will get your questions. We've noted them all, everybody. Thank you for those, and we will we'll look at giving those questions through to EFI, have a look through and see what we can put together a working document for everybody. Okay. Thank you, Henriette. As you were the one who put all of this together, last word for you.
No, just a big thank you to Andrew, who already left, Johan and Werner. I mean, you've put a lot of time aside to get this presentation ready today. We've learned a lot. I can literally almost listen to you for a whole day. So interesting this topic is. So we really appreciate your efforts, but we'll see how we can fit in another session. So thank you, guys. We appreciate it, and it was really great and very valuable. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
So, Sandra, Henriette, can we just stay behind for 1 sec, please?
We will do. Chair, we're just going to wait for Tulani to clear the meeting.